We're going to talk about the importance of commitment, and I would like to start with a definition. Commitment is a kind of decision. That's the first thing we have to say about it. It's a kind of decision. And so that's where the definition has to begin, with a definition of decision. When we decide, we choose one option among many. So typically, it's when we make a decision, it's a decision about a course of action. But this decision can also be a decision about people, about a person. So when a couple gets engaged, that's a decision. When we choose friends, that's a decision. So it's a choice. The choice also entails the exclusion of other options. So when we make a decision, there's a positive and a negative dimension to it. There is a reaching towards something positively, and there is a delimitation, some kind of exclusion. So that's where we would start, with a definition of decision. So it's a choice of something, and it's an exclusion of other things. A commitment is a decision, but it's an open-ended decision. Now, the way I would like to describe it is, it's a decision to decide again and again. It's a decision to re-decide. So it's a choice that we make, always to renew that choice and always to exclude other options in favor of the option that we've chosen. So there's a background to this kind of decision, this decision to decide or redecide. And the background is the changing landscapes of time. So all of us can look at where we are today and compare it to where we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Try to remember the things that filled your life when you were in high school and compare that to where you are today, okay? Well, that's a change of landscape. That's a change of landscape. And some of that change we can control, not very much. Some of it we can control by the choices we make, but a lot of it we can't. So we couldn't control the planes that flew into the Twin Towers on 9/11. Okay, but that changed the landscape of our nation. So, and you can go through all the great events of history that way. Not many of us had much control over the collapse of the economy a few years back. But it affects all of us. So that's the background for commitment, the changing landscapes of time. So, and as time changes, it presents new possibilities, new options. So as time changes, for instance, we meet new people. New people move into our neighborhood or into our town, or we move. Families grow, children arrive, and so on. So the changing landscapes of time involve the presentation of new options. Commitment presupposes a certain flexibility in us, a certain nimbleness, a sure-footedness amongst these changes. I like to think of it as what sailors call their sea legs. Your ability to walk, for instance, on a deck that's pitching. And the name for this ability is the second most important element of commitment, and that's faithfulness. The first important element is the element of decision. The second element is the element of faithfulness or fidelity. So a decision is always a perfection for us. It's always a perfection. All the powers of our being come to focus in a decision. Any decision. Now, sometimes we can make bad decisions, but we're still focusing the powers of our being in that bad decision. The choices we make, we're focusing ourselves. We are defining ourselves. So decision is always a perfection for us. And a commitment, since it's a decision to decide or redecide, is the perfection of a perfection. So the first level of perfection within us is the achievement of virtue. This requires discipline. This requires a lot of little decisions. For Aristotle, the virtues, the great virtues like justice, temperance, prudence, fortitude, these are a moderation of our appetites and our desires. It's a moderation that allows us to be good citizens. So we don't just kill everyone we get angry with. We don't just fire missiles from our car at every driver that cuts us off on the highway. So for Aristotle, the virtues allow for good citizenship. For Thomas Aquinas, who used the thought of Aristotle, the virtues allow charity. And charity is the perfection of all the virtues. All the virtues make charity possible. And to the extent that we're not virtuous, it is more difficult for us to be charitable. The virtues are good habits. Their opposites, the vices, are bad habits. So, commitment perfects virtue. Commitment gives virtue its significance and meaning. All of my striving for virtue is perfected in my commitment. So think of the powers of our being, the powers of our soul. Think of our desires, our appetites. And think of them kind of piled up in a heap on the floor, okay? So a commitment basically turns that heap into a marionette. The commitment lifts that heap, and we find out that there is a unity to all these powers, to all these desires, to all these appetites. And that's what commitment does for us. So, the marionette, of course, is under the control of the marionettist. And to use this analogy that I'm talking about, we become, through this process of decision and commitment, we become both the marionette and the marionettist. Nobody else is pulling our strings. We have to figure out how to do that for ourselves. So those are a few general observations about commitment. The great commitments in the church are marriage and celibacy. Marriage is a commitment to one other and no one else. So we still believe in monogamy. That's going to be the next thing that goes after the acceptance of gay marriage, monogamy. But we still believe in it. And certainly as Catholics, we will always believe in it. And celibacy is the same thing. It's a commitment to one other, where the other is the church. So both of these commitments presuppose the virtues of charity, temperance, and chastity. Chastity as an integration of the power of my sexuality into the whole of my personality. In marriage, this integration is expressed in the love of the spouse. In celibacy, it is expressed in continence, the refraining from all sexual activity. Marriage and celibacy have the same two basic meanings: union and generation. In marriage, this is about the communion of life, the spouses, and about the begetting and education of children. In celibacy, this is about pastoral charity and what has been called traditionally spiritual fatherhood. So that's a general outline of what commitment is about and where we experience it, at least in the church. We do not speak of the single life as a commitment in the church. This may be a defect in our theology, but I just want to make that clear. We speak of marriage and we speak of celibacy, and various kinds of celibacy. Priestly celibacy doesn't have the same meaning quite as the meaning of celibacy for religious women, for instance. So now I want to talk about some of the complicating factors. The first one is a temperamental issue around the issue of decisiveness. So we just know this from our experience. Some people are more decisive than others. Decisive people tend to be critical of indecisive people, and that's what they call them, indecisive people. And the people who are not as ready to make decisions tend to think of decisive people as rash or in a hurry. So those are temperamental issues. Sometimes indecisiveness stems from a weakness in the personality. And I see a lot of this, frankly. People that have this weakness in their personality need help, and so they will come to a clergyman, they will come to a counselor to ask for help with making a decision. So the name of this weakness is abulia, if you're taking notes. Abulia, A-B-U-L-I-A. But some people, by temperament, just like to keep their options open as long as they can. That's not necessarily a weakness of personality, it's just a temperamental preference. So that's one complicating factor. So if you're a man or a woman and you're very serious in a relationship with someone and you're ready to move on to engagement and marriage and the other person isn't, this creates a frustration, it creates a tension in the relationship. It could be about just a difference of temperament. But the biggest thing that throws everything out of whack is the power of sin. The disintegrating centrifugal power of sin. So virtue is not easy to achieve or to re-achieve. And a commitment is not simple to make or to keep. And then you have to deal with sin. And I don't know how to describe sin. Sin is not really anything positive. We learned this from St. Augustine. Sin is the absence of something. So it's like a sweater unraveling. That's what sin is like. It's like an unraveling, a disintegration. So something should be there that's not. That's sin, and that's the way sin affects us. So it manifests itself in ways we're all very familiar with. The primary way it manifests itself is in selfishness, self-centeredness, pride. So we overvalue ourselves. We undervalue others. We undervalue the communal situations we have to deal with. So against that background, the disintegrative power of sin, we have the remedy of salvation. Salvation brings healing. It re-knits what came unraveled. But even there, it doesn't happen once for all, not psychologically anyway, not sociologically. This is one of the problems I think we have in our politics. We tend to think that, if I just vote for this candidate, this is going to be the salvation of the country. And it never has been. So sociologically, it's only partial. And all we have to do is look at our own experience of salvation to recognize this. Okay, we know that we're saved. We're all saved through Christ. We've been baptized. That means we've been justified. But we keep sinning. We keep sinning. I mean, we're embarrassed about it. I can't tell you how many times I have had to tell people in confession, please don't be embarrassed. I'm not here to be entertained. You do not have to invent a whole new slate of sins for the next time you come to confession. We're all struggling with something in our lives, growth issues, and they may change over time, but most of us just keep confessing the same sins over and over again because they have more power in our lives than we want them to. So we know it's easy to fall away. It is easy to fall away. It is easy to realize imperfectly what salvation is about. So what I want to say is that the order of salvation pays particular attention to commitment and to its presuppositions, because these are the ordinary path to order in society and to order in the personality and to human happiness, both individual and communal. So, in the order of salvation, the commitment of marriage is a sacrament. That commitment is subsumed under the meaning of Christ's covenant with the church, the spousal love that Christ has for the church. And celibacy is even more directly a symbol of the same thing. The priest takes the church as his spouse. This is the reason why bishops wear a ring. It's a wedding ring. The bishop's ring is a wedding ring. So, those are two complicating factors. the temperamental differences about decision-making, and the disintegrative power of sin. Then I want to add a third complication. And this is a reflection of what's been going on in Western society, certainly since World War I. World War I was really the end of Western civilization. We've been in a period of transition since then. One of the writers I respect a lot in National Review described the Great War, which is what, remember, in history everybody called World War I the Great War, as lasting from 1914 to 1989, and the collapse of European communism. So the European powers did not get it right at the end of World War I, which set the stage for World War II. In World War I, the conditions were set for the rise of the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks turned into the communists, and we had to deal with the communists throughout the course of the Cold War. So that's the Great War. That's the Great War. And it has had devastating effects on Western civilization. Devastating. It devastated our morality. And we, the Allies that won World War II, cannot be over proud on this account, okay? The firebombing of Dresden was evil. Even though it was done by the Allies, it was evil. As was the use of the atomic bombs in Japan. That was evil. We cannot be proud of that. But that's what the Great War brought us to, that kind of destruction of morality. This is a personal vice of mine, okay, but I love reading spy novels. I love reading spy novels. And the best of the writers, as far as I'm concerned, is Jerome Le Carré. Because you can see, he actually draws characters. You know, besides complicated plots, he creates characters. And you can see what the deception of the art of espionage is doing to their character. Again, that's nothing to be proud of. So, my point is, the Great War from 1914 to 1989 has devastated Western morality. So one of the factors that affects our idea of commitment as a society is, this is an author I've used with you before. His name is Philip Rieff. He's a sociologist. He died just a few years ago in his 90s. But one of the things that has militated against the idea of commitment for us is what he calls the negative community. So the traditional community, if you will, has a positive value. It is something that people make commitments to. It is something that people want to contribute to. It is something worth making a sacrifice for. That's the traditional community. The negative community, the only thing people are committed to is staying out of each other's way and keeping other people out of our way. That's the negative community. So the highest value in the negative community is what Rieff calls a manipulable sense of well-being. A sense of well-being. And the fact that it's manipulable is highly significant. This is one of the reasons why advertising has so much power in our society. Just as an aside, this is not an original insight of mine, but as an aside, the most consistent message we get from advertisers, okay, and this will be 15 minutes out of every hour on television, the most consistent message we get from advertisers is, you are not good enough. So they never come right out and say it, but that's the implication of all those ads for makeup, okay, all those ads for expensive cars. So, and all the other things I don't even want to mention. We're almost getting to the point where advertising is not suitable for a family view. So this manipulable sense of well-being. The only commitment is to the self then, and to feeling good. That's the sense of well-being. So anything that interferes with my sense of well-being can be discarded. The most important thing to discard is guilt. And the next most important thing after that is commitment. Because both of these things can interfere with my feeling good all the time. So, of course, what I mean by that is sometimes commitment does not feel good. Okay? Parents certainly know this. When you have a newborn in the house and you have to get up at 2 or 4 in the morning, and you're tired the rest of the next day, that doesn't feel good. That does not feel good. So commitments are discardable. And that's one of the primary characteristics of contemporary society. We have casual commitments, if you can call them such. That's a contradiction in terms, but casual commitments, broken commitments, and saddest of all, we have non-commitments. The inability or the refusal to make commitments. So this process is accelerated by the sundering of sexuality from love or procreation. So this is by chemical, surgical means and contraception, sterilization, abortion. And this is what the culture wars are about. It's the negative community versus the positive community. So cultural progressives have identified themselves with the negative community. And let me be a little bit clear about this label, okay? I'm talking simply about the culture war and the definition of family and sexuality. Okay? I am not talking about health care. I'm not talking about socialism or what have you. I'm just talking about a very focused issue. The ability to make and keep commitments. So, culture progressives know this, and they are playing for keeps. So, the church is a culturally conservative force in the cultural wars. Not necessarily all the time in the political war, but in the cultural battles it is. And right now, in my opinion, it is facing overwhelming odds. It's not simply that we have an organized and powerful cultural foe. Okay, they control the media, so they control the nation's image of itself. The news and the entertainment media. They control academia for the most part. Not completely, but for the most part. And so they have an enormous influence in our society. The progressives have taken over a lot of the Protestant churches. So, and they're it's kind of like the ocean waves in the ocean. They're battering the Catholic Church as well. So it's an organized and powerful foe. But that's not what we should be most concerned about. The reason why I consider the odds to be overwhelming is because all of us, even very committed Catholics, carry the tendencies of the negative community in ourselves. So it's not simply that we're being battered from without, but it's kind of like, when floodwaters rise, all right, they will come up, for instance, through the sewers going into the homes that are behind the levee. and they just keep rising. So, what I would say about the negative community is that it is never difficult to rationalize irresponsibility. Never. Irresponsibility constantly presents itself as responsibility and as freedom, and it constantly puts forth a plausible defense. But it is not freedom. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. But I want to say one other thing about the cultural wars. Progressives do not acknowledge the cultural war because they believe they have won. So it's part of one of the characteristics of their outlook that they believe progress is inevitable. They believe that it is happening and will happen and has happened. So when they look to the sexual revolution, they see progress. I see decay. I see decay. The only good thing the sexual revolution has given us is that we can talk about sex a little more comfortably now than we could 50 years ago. But aside from that, it's been mostly caustic, mostly corrosive. So they believe, the progressives believe they have won. Conservatives, I think, have had a major achievement just by keeping the issues alive. So every time a Democrat has been elected president since Roe v. Wade, the media has proclaimed the death of the pro-life movement. And yet the pro-life movement is still kicking and making progress, very slow progress, but it's making progress. So those are the culture wars. It's about commitment, I think, in the end. It's about the nature of commitment. So let me conclude by reminding you that freedom has two dimensions. We're going to talk about freedom. Let's talk about it in its basic, fundamental reality. There are two dimensions. One is psychological, and the other, I'm going to give you a $50 word here, the other is ontological. So the psychological pertains to the realm of our awareness. So in the psychological definition of freedom is what I've given you, one choice among many options. But there is a deeper level to freedom, and that's the ontological, which is the level of our being. This is the dimension of freedom that never gets talked about. But at the level of our being, we only have one choice: to be what God has created us to be, namely His servants and His children. So to be the members of His household that He has destined us to be. So if He wanted to, He could have created little automatons that would just sit around telling Him how great He is all the time, because He's programmed them to do that. But that's not what He did. He created beings with freedom that can accept what He has begun in them and bring it to completion in cooperation with His grace, or to refuse. To refuse is to choose incoherence. It's not to choose the opposite. It's not as if the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. There's nothing on the other side of the fence. So, one of the things I like to say when I talk about freedom in this sense is the church is shockingly pro-choice. But there's only one option. that's responsible. And that is the option of being God's servants, God's children, honored members of God's household. In the order of grace, our choice is preceded by God's choice. The Old Testament is filled with this idea. God has chosen a people to be his own. And he has not chosen any other people for that favor. So the New Testament widens the offer. So there was a single chosen people in the Old Testament. That was to teach us the nature of God's choice. Then in the New Testament, God's choice through Christ is extended to the entirety of creation. So God chose us in Christ to be holy and perfect in his sight. He has done this. He has chosen every single human being. The grace of Christ is to be offered to all. So God has chosen us. And this is probably the most important thing to say about it. In choosing us, God is also faithful. God is faithful to his covenant. His bond to us, the name for the bond, his bond with us, covenant love, is in Hebrew hesed. It's a word that can't be translated by a single word in English. But it's a steadfast love. It's a sturdy love. It's an enduring love. And his hesed endures forever. So in Exodus 34:6, he gives us his name, okay? I am going to recite for you God's full name, first, middle, and last name. The Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, chesed, and faithfulness. That's the God we worship. Finally, in the New Testament, he gives us something to do once we have understood, once we have realized, once we've begun to accept his love. He gives us homework. This is my command. Love one another as I have loved you. So he gives us the command, and with the command, he gives us the gift of the Spirit that makes it possible for us to live that command. So that goes back to what I was saying earlier about salvation, the order of salvation. Mends. It reknits. It brings together what was separated. So those are some reflections on commitment. I would like to end by reading a passage from you from Psalm 103. This is one of my favorite psalms, and I sometimes assign this as a penance in the confessional. For as the heavens are high above the earth, so surpassing is his kindness, his chesed, toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he put our transgressions from us. As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. Man's days are like those of grass. Like a flower of the field, he blooms. The wind sweeps over him, and he is gone, and his place knows him no more. but the kindness, the hesed of the Lord is from eternity to eternity toward those who fear him, and his justice towards children's children among those who keep his covenant and remember to fulfill his precepts. So, do we have a few minutes for questions? Questions, comments?
There was something that came up in our small group, and I wondered, is commitment always individual, or can there be communal commitment?
No, communities can make commitments. I don't know of ceremonies, like a wedding ceremony, when you talk about communal commitments, but maybe the Mass would fall into that category. So there were great ceremonies in the Old Testament when the people accepted the covenant. Moses, Joshua ratified the covenant with the people. We do that every time we celebrate Mass. And I also want to say that about celibacy. Celibacy is a communal commitment. So it's not simply that the celibate is pledging himself to the church, but the church is pledging herself to the celibate. The celibate standing, of course, in the place of Christ. Anyone else? Question?
It's hard to come up with questions. What you said is, it has both a clarity and a heaviness to it. And it's also like 180 degrees from what most of us live with every day. Kind of that cultural issue. I think the thing that you said that really caught me the most was, in a sense, that without commitment, what we live is incoherence. And if there's anything, I think, that really captures the experience of today's culture, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's with young people, whether it's in marriages, it's incoherence. Even if you walk into most businesses today, they're incoherent. There isn't any real givens that you can count on for a long period of time. There's just nothing that you can, in a sense, build on and say, this will be here. Mm-hmm. We are all working to sustain this. So the whole question of sustainability becomes it's a major issue in almost everything, because the only thing that makes anything sustainable is people committed to it.
Right, and faithful, committed and faithful. Mm-hmm. Sustainability is a synonym for faithfulness in that setting.
It is. It's kind of today's thing about it. But when we talk about sustainability today, we talk about energy, we talk about the green thing, resources, right. But we are not talking about people's commitment.
And we're not talking about a moral ecology. I'm convinced that this is built into us, okay? The natural law is built into us, and commitment, I think, is the highest expression of natural law. So that incoherence that you're talking about is going on against the backdrop of a vague feeling that something's not right.
Yeah.
And that's probably the strongest way the natural law can manifest itself right now. I could go on and on about this, but the demographic implosion that's going on in the West, it's a moral question. It's a serious moral question with sociological ramifications. I'm sorry, Brian.
No, it's okay. You talked about progressives as a term for those that are kind of battering the church. You said from without, but also from within, and I thought you were gonna say like, you know, people within the church, you know, that are trying to, I don't know, maybe it is in another way, that are actively working against the church, but from within. But if I heard you right, you put it in the sense of, because we are all part of our culture and we've been
Right.
enculturated in ourselves some of that progressiveness,
Mhm.
and that then hurts the church.
Some elements of the negative community, yeah.
Negative community.
Yeah, I think it's much more important to stay focused on that than to point your fingers at ecclesiastical progressives.
Yeah, that-
Their power is waning. They were very powerful in the church, you know, in the 80s and 90s, but their power is waning. But what I'm talking about, the danger that I'm talking about is not. So in my triad, one of the other people that was in the triad talked about an older brother who divorced, you know, and is living with somebody at age 60. I remember this. I didn't say this in the group, but I remember when I was first ordained, one of my teachers in the seminary left the priesthood at age 60 and got married. And one of my other teachers said, what this proves is insanity has no age limit.